Hello, welcome to the channel Why Stories. Enjoy watching.
Life's hardships suddenly struck Sergio. Although calling what happened to him hardships would be too mild. In reality, it was a sentence. A dead sentence. For Sergio, the scene when he and Marina sat hand in hand in the doctor's office was etched into his memory. Now, every day started with that image. The doctor, in a routine manner, as he probably had done 100 times before, announced, "Pancreatic cancer. Stage 4. Inoperable." To the standard question in such cases, "How much time do I have left?" came the standard answer. "It depends on many factors, it's hard to make a prognosis now." And again, after a pause, assuming the patient wouldn't relent easily, the doctor specified, "Maybe 3 months, 6 months, a year, 2. 10% of patients with your diagnosis survive more than 5 years. In any case, the help could only be palliative, which means a strict diet, chemotherapy, and, in the end, hospice care if there are available spots." Marina clung to Sergio's hand so tightly as if it were her own diagnosis. And Sergio understood that he would probably do the same if he were in her place. Living alongside a dying person, knowing you can't help them, is only slightly better than dying yourself. At home, Sergio did his best to reassure his wife. He caressed her head, kissed her tear-soaked cheeks, and in response to all the rhetorical questions like "What have we done to offend God?" and "Why did this happen to us of all people?" he replied that it just happened, and who were they to judge God? Besides, it didn't just happen to them that day, but also to 10 million other unfortunate souls worldwide. That's the annual statistic that usually goes unnoticed until you find yourself on that list. Then they bought a thin school notebook with lines. It was more convenient for drawing up tables, and for 2 evenings in a row, they calculated the budget needed for the expected course of treatment. Marina suggested continuing the table over 4 years, but Sergio still convinced her to stop at 8 months, thinking to himself that even this might be too much, he wouldn't last much longer. However, they had no financial cushion left after the latest crisis, and their salaries were being delayed. There were no signs of economic improvement in the near future. Sergio considered whether to sell the old house of his late grandfather, hidden in the depths of the woods, somewhere on the outskirts, close to the borders. But his intuition told him not to even bring it up with Marina. Firstly, she didn't even know that his grandfather had passed away 2 years ago. And secondly, the reason for her misfortune was that she never liked that grandfather from the moment Sergio introduced them at the wedding. Right in the middle of the celebration, the grandfather tapped her on the forehead and quietly said instead of advice, "You'll ruin my grandson. The black fire follows you." And Sergio wouldn't be able to sell this house. When he secretly went to bury his grandfather's body last year, without Marina's knowledge, the village appeared to him entirely different from what he had seen in his childhood. Almost all the houses were abandoned, the fences had slouched, and the barns, as if out of shame for their owners, had sunk into the ground. The village was dying. Even at the cemetery, only 3 people came: Sergio himself, Grandpa Gonza, who had spent his whole life as a tractor driver on the long-defunct bean farm, and some drunkard Sergio didn't recognize. As later became clear during the memorial, this drunkard turned out to be none other than the former director of the local club, who had spent many years trying to defend his cultural center for the sake of the village's so-called revival, but eventually succumbed to the pressure first from profiteers who arranged cheap action movies in the club, and then from a historical process, in which there was no place for a village with the strange and a bit offensive name Goofs. However, plans are one thing, and reality turned out to be quite different from the intended scenario. Expenses at the beginning weren't as significant. Except for the bribes they had to give to the doctors, they only had to splurge on medicine, a steamer, a stack of absorbent diapers prepared in advance, and a bucket with a seat for those gloomy times when Sergio wouldn't be able to make it to the bathroom himself. All of this looked as depressing as buying soap in a perfumery department for greasing the loop that slowly tightened around Sergio's neck. Soon they crossed out all these items from their list, stashed the bucket with diapers away from sight, and in the evenings, they simply played checkers without talking much. Only about new movies and, just once, about a book that Marina had suddenly decided to read. "Have you ever read Solzhenitsyn?" she asked one day. "The Gulag Archipelago." "I had to in college," Sergio replied. "How about Cancer Ward?" she enthusiastically inquired. "No, never got around to it." "You should. I'm reading it now." "Found the time, huh?" Sergio was surprised. "Well, just the title is scary. But it's about love and stuff." "Did you know Solzhenitsyn had cancer too?" "I did." "And then he cured himself?" "I think it's not quite like that. I know what the novel is about." "Did you read about the etched route there?" "Well, it's just a plot device. Solzhenitsyn himself was treated quite traditionally in a hospital. But there are cases of self-healing, right?" Marina persisted. "I suppose so, yes," Sergio calmly agreed. "1 person in 10 million patients, and not with stage 4, Marina." "But I feel this way," his wife sounded embarrassed. "There's still hope." "Of course, Mari, where would we be without hope?" "Oh, Sergio," his wife sighed, "you don't mind if I go see Matilda now? You won't miss me too much?" "Go ahead, of course. Why are you even asking? I'll watch a movie, then take Wolf for a walk. Everything's fine." Wolf was the name of their dog. Dark, with a silvery sheen, a mongrel, but very clever. He had been living with them for 5 years. As soon as Sergio pronounced his name, Wolf immediately perked up his ears and wagged his tail. It all started with these trips to Matilda's. At first, she went to see her once a week, then every 3 days, and 2 months after her husband fell ill, she was going every day. Sergio understood that most of these visits had nothing to do with Matilda, but he couldn't bring himself to even check it with a phone call. What was there for him to worry about the strength of their family bonds when he had already stepped 1 foot beyond the border of life? But even contemplating it hypothetically was still painful. He was watching turning left from the elevator with Pierre Richard, and tears were rolling down his cheeks onto the pillow. And it wasn't from laughter, but from some internal cork that wouldn't allow them to flow deep into his heart. It wasn't sadness, not resentment, not regret, but a complete emotional collapse, making his consciousness feel fuzzy. He could play checkers well, calculate 5-digit numbers in his mind, and recite poems he seemed to have long forgotten. But simply thinking about life, about Marina, about himself, and where it was all heading, was too much to bear. After shedding all his pain for the day, Sergio washed up, examining his gaunt, yellowish face in the mirror. He called Wolf and went out with him for an evening walk. The June sky burned in the west with a golden-red sunset. The matte silver of the clouds was tinged with melting blue, and the first stars were already pulsating through the expanse of the universe. And in this galaxy, no one had any concern for Sergio, Marina, or a suspicious Wolf. Everything was going its own way. 3 months later, they no longer played checkers or watched movies together. Marina went around looking gloomy and pensive, as if she wanted to say something to Sergio but couldn't muster the courage. She never finished reading Cancer Ward. Instead, she began studying fashion magazines and trying various diets, convincing herself that she had gained too much weight lately. The steamer came in handy, and the menu became more diverse. The nausea, which Sergio had started to get used to, receded, only occasionally making its presence known. Marina was now at home less than during her assumed visits to their mutual friend, at hair salons, and at nail parlors. Most of the budget was now spent on these outings, along with exotic products like miraculous teas and dietary supplements. However, Marina did manage to get rights on disability benefits for Sergio, making it easier to buy certain medications and saving money. Taking advantage of his temporary improvement in health, Sergio began driving his old Mazda out of town with Wolf. On the way there and back, he occasionally picked up passengers as a taxi driver. He stashed his earnings in the glove compartment, trying not to spend it extravagantly. He didn't tell Marina anything about it. The forest was beautiful. Birds were singing, fat hedgehogs were crawling out of the grass onto the sun-warmed paths. It's a shame I probably won't live until September, Sergio thought. Then I could go mushroom picking. Wolf liked the forest even more than Sergio did. For some reason, they hadn't taken him into the wilderness before. They left him in the apartment when they managed to go on a quiet hunt in the fall. Everything here seemed strange and extraordinary to the dog. He inhaled new scents deeply, listened to every rustle and each nightingale's trill, and even seemed to smile, squinting at Sergio and nodding his head to the side, as if saying, "Look, buddy, do you see this?" Incomprehensible to the mind. "And do you hear it? Over there, behind that spruce." And Sergio seemed to understand him and shared in his joy of discovery. Perhaps in recent times, he and Wolf had grown even closer than he had with his wife. Sergio forgot about his illness, walked confidently, looked sharply, and no longer felt the pain that had seemed to never release his back in the morning. And only at home did the pain return. It didn't go away until midnight when Sergio gave in and took a painkiller capsule. Somehow, it had come to pass that Marina and Sergio were now sleeping in separate rooms. What exactly had caused it, Sergio couldn't determine precisely. It just happened. At first, Marina stayed up late reading and supposedly didn't want to disturb him. Then she chatted on the phone with someone in the kitchen for a long time, tightly closing all the doors so that the noise of her voice wouldn't interfere with his sleep. Sergio heard only the monotonous boo-boo-boo, and he thought it would be better if Marina spoke directly to him in person. It didn't irritate him, no, it brought him into a state of melancholy, nuances of which he couldn't quite articulate. One evening, when an annoying light rain began to fall and their forest walk with Wolf had to be ended, Sergio finally decided to call Matilda. He knew her well. They all, Sergio, Marina, Matilda, and her ex-husband Antonio, used to hang out in the same circle. But much had changed since then, and their communication had dwindled to almost nothing. "Yes, I'm listening." Matilda picked up the phone. "Tilda, hi, it's Sergio, if you still remember me." "Sergio!" Matilda joyfully exclaimed. "Haven't seen you in ages." Hi. How are you there?" She paused and then continued. "Well," Sergio grinned, "let's dispense with the pleasantries. I think you understand everything yourself. I'm calling with a question. I've been meaning to call for a while." "Yeah. Is Marina with you now?" "No, Sergio, she was, but..." "Listen, I was so afraid you'd call to ask this, but you never did, and I somehow relaxed, and now I can't figure it out. In short, she's not here." "I see," Sergio said. "That's about what I expected. So, don't worry, everything's fine." Poor Sergio, Matilda's voice was trembling. It was clear that Matilda was crying. "No need, Tilda, what are you doing? You know, there are so many poor souls in the world. There aren't enough tears for all of them. I'm telling you, everything's fine." "I don't understand," Matilda said, choking back tears. "How can she behave like this now? But please, Sergio, don't say that I didn't keep my word. I promised her I wouldn't speak, but I can't help it, Sergio. Marina hasn't visited me in half a month. She's with that doctor, you see." "With the doctor?" "Yes. He helped her put together the benefits for you. She cried, was very upset, afraid that you would hang yourself or do something to yourself. And that doctor happened to come along, washed her brain, and here we are. She even found a place for you in hospice. You know how hard it is to get in there now, right? My brother died of cancer too. I know from the inside what it's like to go through all of this. That's why I can't keep silent, as if I'm committing a crime. I'm sorry, Sergio. But maybe I shouldn't have said it. I'm a fool, you know, weak-willed." And Tilda burst into full-fledged tears, making it clear that there would be no further conversation between them. Sergio waited for another minute and pressed the end button with his finger. Sergio watched Marina suffering as if it wasn't him but she who was incurably ill. Once she hadn't gone anywhere, talking loudly on the phone beforehand. Well, not with someone, but most likely with her doctor. She circled around Sergio while finally suggesting going to the forest for a walk together. Sergio understood that she was motivated by genuine concern, though it seemed more like a gesture of desperation. He too was inspired, ignited by some noble impulse, and gladly agreed. In the forest, they remained silent the whole way, smiling absent-mindedly, picking wild strawberries along the riverbank. Wolf didn't leave their side for a moment, understanding that behind this silence lay the beginning of some trouble, some turning point in his life too. About 10 times, Sergio opened his mouth to start a conversation with Marina about the doctor. Not to reproach her, but to explain how much he understood all of this and to convince her not to feel guilty. They could part as good friends right now and wish each other well. Yes, from the outside, it might have looked like sacrilege, but they lived inside their own crumpled world, and everything should have been clear to them. What did it matter what those on the outside would say? It was still unknown how they themselves would act if they were in their shoes. Sergio wanted to assure his wife that he wouldn't hang himself or drown in a pond. Why did everyone assume such things were possible? In critical situations, a certain reptilian brain kicks in, passed down to humans from distant ancestors who sought refuge from monsters in caves. It activates and sets the task of surviving at all costs. So, she shouldn't worry about that. He wanted to say all of this to her, but he couldn't. Perhaps she was planning to tell him something similar from her side. But in the evening, when they returned from the forest, broken and empty-handed, neither of them thought about words anymore. It was probably their last attempt to dot all the I's. But the words couldn't be found, just like those very I's couldn't be found in the language. Both Sergio and Marina seemed to have finally emptied themselves and understood something of their own. In their understanding, there was only this emptiness and the impossibility of changing anything. Marina talked on the phone in the kitchen until morning, breaking her monologues with her crying. Wolf climbed into bed with Sergio and, licking his unshaven cheek, tried to comfort him. In the morning, Sergio found a note on the kitchen, "Gone on business. We'll be back late in the evening. Sorry, couldn't prepare breakfast." Sergio turned the note over, took a pencil, and wrote as well, "Marina, don't want to write a long letter, just know that I'm doing fine, and you shouldn't expect me back anytime soon. Don't worry and don't look for me. It's necessary." Then he leashed Wolf, went to the garage, started the car, and drove out of town to the village, to his late grandfather's house. Before leaving the city, he filled up the tank, bought groceries, and a bag of dog food. With each kilometer that brought him closer to his destination, his mood improved. Such a simple solution. Why hadn't it occurred to him for so long? Wolf attentively stared at the road, as if he wanted to memorize it well. "What, buddy, steadying our path?" said Sergio with a smile. "That's right, remember it. If something happens to me, you'll find your way back home by yourself. You're a smart one, aren't you, Wolf?" The dog stuck out its tongue, wagged its tail, and barked. Either it scolded Sergio for such a reckless thought, or it conveyed that it could indeed find its way back. 5 hours later, meandering through almost overgrown forest roads, the fugitives reached their destination. But Sergio felt like they had been driving twice longer. In 2 years, the village had changed even more. Only his grandfather's house still looked fairly sturdy, despite no one heating it during the winter. Only the skeletons and foundations of neighboring buildings remained. Only the swallows crisscrossed the sky, refusing to find another village for their nests. Not a single living soul around. Sergio retrieved an equally rusty key from under a barrel and unlocked the creaking door to the porch. A thick wave of mustiness and the smell of rotting wood hit his face. Wolf stood on the porch, bowing his head low and sniffing. He hesitated to go inside. "Come on," encouraged him Sergio. "This is a good house. It's yours for a while now, too. Don't be afraid. Let's go." The dog took a few uncertain steps and followed his owner inside. Everything inside was just as Sergio had left it after his grandfather's memorial 2 years ago. Even the bottles, plates, and crystal glasses were in their places. None of the city stalkers prowling around abandoned houses had made it here yet. Or they didn't find it interesting. Faded Santa Claus on the calendar still hung on the wall with the words Happy New Year. For some reason, his grandfather crossed out days on it, circled others. Those must have been important dates for him. All the marks stopped at September 18th. Sergio went to the well, replaced the old, worn-out bucket with a relatively new one, and drew water. The water was clear, slightly sweet to taste. It had always been like this here, possibly because of the nearby swamps. Inside the house, Sergio washed all the dirty dishes. He filled a large bowl with dog food for Wolf and poured some water into another bowl for him to drink. Wolf just sniffed it but didn't eat. The sudden changes stressed the animal. But it would get used to it. Sergio himself didn't feel like eating either. It wouldn't hurt to start the stove. In about 3 days, all the mustiness should be gone if everything was done properly. Then he could relax and reconsider his unclear plans once more. In the closets, they found a lot of clothing and bedding. It smelled awful, but that could be fixed too. Approximately estimating the extent of the upcoming life arrangements, Sergio decided to take a walk. At least reach Grandpa Gonza's. Wolf began to gradually settle in. He no longer clung to the legs, but ran far from the owner, exploring the area. Grandpa Gonza's house turned out to be empty. There wasn't even a lock on the door. When Sergio went inside, he immediately realized he wouldn't find the village's tractor driver Grandpa. He wasn't there, just like anyone else, except for him and Wolf. On his way to the club, Sergio walked with a clear understanding that he wouldn't meet the drunk director either. It's all so sad. People have gone, as if they had never been here, no messages, no mournful songs, nothing. They melted away like spring snow, flowed away like streams, leaving only fragments of memory, withered and tangled, like pictures from a half-forgotten dream. Sergio sighed heavily. And suddenly he heard, up ahead, behind the road's turn, Wolf barking. Sergio quickened his pace, emerged from behind the trees, and saw someone bending down, digging through the wreckage of the destroyed club, paying no attention to the barking dog. Approaching even closer, he couldn't believe his eyes. "Grandma Sarah!" he exclaimed. "Wolf, quiet. Come to me." The dog fell silent and, running up to his owner, sat down at his feet. The woman straightened her back, turned around, and squinted as she looked at Sergio. "Look what the cat dragged in," she said loudly. "Oleska?" "Of course. And I'm the one and only Grandma Sarah. Who else did you expect to meet here?" Everyone in this village knew Grandma Sarah well. Her house stood far away, on the outskirts, right by the swamps. When Sergio was a boy, he and his friends used to sneak to her hut in the evenings, hiding in the bushes and trying to stay upwind, just to catch a glimpse of some witchcraft, which, as the adults warned them, Grandma Sarah would perform right before sunset. They imagined that she would brew some animal or even a stolen baby from a neighboring village in a huge cauldron. Or maybe she would summon the spirits of the deceased from the nearest cemetery, and they would all have a feast under the night sky. Even a talking crow or an owl perched on her shoulder would be interesting. That would be spooky too. But every time, only Pirate the fierce, shaggy dog appeared, and they scattered in all directions, forgetting everything in the world. Sometimes at night, Grandma Sarah would wander through the village for no apparent reason. Even the heavily drunk men, returning home to their wives after midnight, sobered up if they encountered her on the way. Everyone feared Grandma Sarah, everyone considered her a witch, but at the same time, if someone fell ill, they would immediately run to her by the swamps for herbs, spells, and predictions of the nearest future. So, although they feared Grandma Sarah, they respected her. Sergio's grandfather, in particular, often visited the swamp and sometimes returned from there in the early morning. At the same time, he was not at risk of any illness, and he didn't need any spells. There were some relations between him and this woman that only they understood, and no one wanted to delve into the details. It was with her light touch that Sergio's grandfather had made his opinion clear at Marina's wedding when he tapped her forehead with his finger. And it turned out that he was partly right, although, of course, all of it was just a coincidence and superstitious nonsense. Sergio approached the old woman and gently hugged her. "How glad I am to see you," he sincerely said. "It seems like me and Wolf are the only inhabitants around here. You've got a good dog." Grandma Sarah looked at the dog. "Smart." Wolf wagged his tail again, acknowledging the unfamiliar person. "And what about Grandpa Gonza?" Sergio hesitated, not sure how to phrase his question. "No, Gonzalo has been gone for a year now. So now I'm the only one left here. And Perez, the former club director, just disappeared. It's been 3 months since anyone heard or saw him. Why didn't you come to my grandfather's funeral? You were friends with him, as far as I remember. You didn't invite me." "Well, I thought that." "And nobody said anything?" "Oh, I'm joking, Grandma Sarah laughed. "Of course, I understand what you thought. But have I not seen at that cemetery? I bid farewell to your grandfather my own way, everything in order. Without all these empty conversations about how good he was and how we'll miss him now. I saw your trio at the cemetery, but I didn't want to impose. How are you managing everything here on your own now?" "What do I have to manage here? It's just me and my little hut. It's been standing there for 5 years without asking for anything. Pirate has long since given his soul to God. He lived as long as dogs don't. And do I need much now, in my old age? Looks like you didn't handle your affairs too well." Grandma Sarah took Sergio's hand and looked into his eyes in a special way. "I told your grandfather," she began again, "that this wife would bring grief to his grandson. Then I called you to the village to fix everything. I promised your grandfather that when death came to take him away." "Fix what?" Sergio said fearfully and instinctively pulled his hand away. "Extinguish the black flame that corrodes your insides. Cancer, I think that's what you call it." "Who told you?" Sergio's question sounded silly. "The one who told me, you, Sergio, are not familiar with, and you probably won't want to get acquainted with. Do you remember where my house is in the swamp? When you get used to the house, when you put your mind in order, then come to me together. Stay for a day or two. We have a long and complicated task ahead of us, but there's a glimmer of light at the end of the path. I think I'll be able to fulfill your grandfather's last will. Just don't delay it. When you see the fog creeping in outside, head for the swamp. My days are numbered too. Not much time left." But the fog had only clouded Sergio's mind. He struggled to find meaning in the old woman's words, as if he had returned to his childhood, only this time he had witnessed a witch's spell at sunset. When the fog finally cleared, Grandma Sarah had disappeared without a trace. Wolf looked at him, sticking out his tongue and panting heavily. "Did you see that?" Sergio asked the dog. The dog made a slight head movement, as if indicating towards the swamp, then turned 3 times counterclockwise and trotted back towards the house, occasionally stopping and looking back at Sergio frozen in place. He sighed and finally followed the dog. After 3 days, the room and the pantry had indeed aired out completely. Sergio had heated the stove twice, first cleaning the chimney with a rag soaked in gasoline. Sparks crackled all around. Sergio even got scared that a fire might break out in some of the neighboring house ruins, but everything turned out fine. Lately, he had hardly been eating, fearing that he would feel nauseous again. And his appetite still hadn't returned. However, he found himself with unexpected strength, and he didn't feel tired by the end of the day. Wolf also seemed to enjoy their new life in the village. He liked it here. He explored every nook and cranny, climbed into all the gaps that were only accessible to him, as if searching for something long lost in this wilderness. Thinking back to his somewhat unbelievable encounter with Grandma Sarah, Sergio felt his desire to visit the old acquaintance grow with each passing day. Could she have simply been a figment of his imagination? Who knows how his disease might manifest itself in its final stages? Pain at night, although not as intense as in the city, still reminded him of the cowardly temptation to go back, returning everything to its familiar course, the mouth of which was already distinctly outlined on the horizon. But as soon as he lay down after taking his painkiller dose, Sergio started berating himself for his lack of courage and persuading himself that moving to the village was the only right decision. On the fourth morning, the fog that had spread under his window finally strengthened his determination to visit the old acquaintance. He whistled for Wolf, stepped outside, and headed towards the forest. He remembered the way well, but orienting himself in the fog was challenging, and he often stopped to recalibrate his internal compass. Ahead, invisible to the eye, Wolf barked, as if guiding him in the right direction. But the dog had never been inside Grandma Sarah's house before. How could he know where to go in this impenetrable fog? Perhaps, while wandering without his owner, he had managed to scout out the path. About 40 minutes later, Sergio and the dog reached their intended destination. Grandma Sarah's house had darkened with age. The paint had peeled off, the window frames were crooked, and the foundation was almost hidden from view, with only the lower ring adorned with old iron remaining visible. Sergio knocked on the cracked glass of the farthest window from the porch. Wolf barked loudly. A woman's head briefly appeared in the window, and a minute later, Grandma Sarah appeared on the doorstep, without a scarf, with her snow-white hair disheveled. "Come in," she said, and disappeared back inside. The scents in this house were completely different. For Wolf's inquisitive spirit, this was probably a real feast. For Sergio himself, it was the realization of a long-forgotten childhood dream of uncovering the mystery of this strange woman who had once frightened the entire village. The air was filled with the smell of herbs, which were hung and spread everywhere, in the barn, in the room above the stove with a cot, on the windowsills, and on old newspapers by the walls on the floor. In the red corner, there was a peculiar icon with a saint whose head was that of a dog, instead of the usual human one. This especially caught Sergio's attention. Not that it scared him, but it did make him somewhat uneasy. Grandma Sarah, who had by this time tied a scarf around her head, noticed Sergio's discomfort and explained. "This is St. Christopher, the guide to the land of the dead. Once, he helped Christ pass through the gates of hell so that he could free the eternal martyrs and give them a chance at salvation. Have you never seen him?" "No. The current church doesn't favor him. And it's a mistake. Although now he looks different, more human." Wolf also gazed at the icon attentively, but there were no questions in his eyes. Perhaps he accepted this fact as a matter of course. However, another character had caught his interest. A crow, as black as pitch, perched on a small pole in the opposite corner, comically scratching its head with a large, shiny beak. Wolf barked, and the crow looked at him in surprise, retracting its paw from under its wing and responding with an identical bark. Wolf looked at Sergio. This time, it seemed he had questions. Grandma Sarah chuckled. "This is pitch black," she said. "Pirate taught him to bark. Sometimes, he reminds me of words I start to forget. There's no one to talk to now." "I see," a mesmerized Sergio replied. As for the crow, they had been right in his childhood after all. "And now, you have something to do," Grandma Sarah abruptly changed the subject. "I have a bathhouse behind the house. I only use it for drying herbs now. I haven't heated it in a long time. I don't need that much water anymore. But you should find the strength and get some firewood. There's a spring to the right behind the bush when you go back on the path you came. Heat it up nicely and steam yourself so that all your pores open up. Don't spare the heat. We're not in a hurry today. Tomorrow, when you wake up, we'll go to the swamp." "Why go to the swamp?" "We'll be looking for a particular herb called ledum." "Ledum." Pitch Black repeated loudly after his owner. Sergio jumped. Wolf looked at him again with a questioning look. "Go," Grandma Sarah waved her hand. "We'll have a little chat here with your little dog. You see, he has so many questions. Haven't you visited your grandfather's grave yet?" Not yet. I've been busy with the house. Well, that's the right thing to do. Go in 4 days. By then, another reason will arise. What reason? A direct one, Grandma Sarah said pensively and crossed herself, looking at the icon. Honestly, Grandma Sarah, you're scaring me, Sergio admitted. Then don't be scared, the old woman looked into his eyes. Conserve your strength. The most interesting part is still ahead. Indeed, Sergio thought. It would have been better not to start this topic. He stepped into the porch, took 2 buckets, and headed for the spring. Wolf obediently trotted along. The fog outside had dissipated, revealing the wild beauty of the forest, with the western edge gradually transitioning into the expanse of swampy marshes. The sky appeared high and richly blue. The day promised to be fine. At least, Sergio no longer doubted the reality of Grandma Sarah. He simply attributed her mysterious words to her character. Perhaps, all fortune-tellers and witches were supposed to talk like that. Besides, the bathhouse would be useful for him in any case. Unlike the old hut, his grandfather's house had completely fallen apart and was unsuitable for its original purpose. Work had been grueling, but the trip to the spring turned out to be short. By noon, Sergio had stoked the stone-clad fireplace, found a pine broom in the anteroom, and joyfully whipped himself on the sides, feeling the heat penetrate into the depths of his weary body. Doctors had strictly forbidden all procedures involving excessive heat, and he wasn't even supposed to stay in the sun for too long. But caring about such trivialities seemed inappropriate to him now. Everything in his life had gone awry. Towards the end of the procedure, Grandma Sarah's voice echoed from the anteroom. Don't overdo it, Sergio. That's enough. Wrap the lower part with a towel, but don't get dressed. Just come into the house like that. Sergio did as instructed by the old woman. This time, she didn't let Wolf into the house. During the time Sergio was steaming in the bath, she must have actually had a conversation with the dog because now he obeyed her just as unquestioningly as Sergio did. The scents in the house became richer and sharper. Steam emanated from a large cast-iron cauldron, and most of the new aromas came from it. Grandma Sarah seated Sergio on a stool right in front of the fireplace, and she placed a plastic basin filled with warm, reddish water under his feet. Swinging a bundle of herbs like a fan, the woman stood behind Sergio and placed her left hand on his crown. Sergio's body, which had cooled down slightly, began to fill with warmth again. His scalp tingled, and soon this tickling sensation reached his very core, spreading outwards as if transcending the limits of his physical shell. Grandma Sarah muttered some words in an unfamiliar language that Sergio couldn't comprehend. He only managed to discern forest, eating, and am. Then his mind began to buzz and blur, like a radio receiver losing its signal. Separate frames from his past flickered before his eyes. There was his lively mother, laughing while looking at something through the window. The very first day at his grandfather's in the village. How old was Sergio then? 4 or 5 years old. Warm, rough hands of his grandfather, his mother's laughter again. And a magpie perched on the windowsill. Then they scattered through the forest in the thickening darkness, full of daring mixed with fear, settling somewhere deep inside his abdomen, urging faster and faster until they culminated in a bright flash of light. Sergio came to himself only in the morning. He was lying on the stove, covered not with a blanket but with a pile of herbs and dry sunflower petals, or so it seemed to him. The sun had risen above the pine trees and shone directly into his eyes through the window. He was without clothes, not even a towel. The evening pain, which was mitigated solely by painkillers, had passed him by. Now he felt only a slight tingling at the base of his spine, as happens when a wound begins to heal. He got up carefully and gently descended from the stove. Wolf was already waiting for him downstairs, wagging his entire body with joy. His clothes were laid out on the bench. Sergio quickly dressed, and as he did, a familiar voice came from the threshold of the adjacent room. Grandma Sarah stood there with her hands crossed on her chest. "Well, that's good," she said. "Have some tea, and then we'll get ready to go. Cawed. Cawed the crow in agreement, this time in its own, bird-like language. When they stood on the edge of the swamp, uncertainty gripped Sergio once again. The scene before him was quite intimidating. Could you even walk through this marsh at all? Sergio was about to ask why they needed to bring him along for this let-him expedition, but he remained silent. He carried a load on his back. Before the trip, Grandma Sarah had piled a bundle of straw on him, not too heavy but quite bulky. He didn't inquire about the purpose of the straw in the swamp either. With knee-high rubber boots and long sticks in their hands, they set out on their way. Wolf had been ordered to stay home and guard the chickens. Sergio couldn't remember when he had last eaten properly, and it was amazing that he didn't feel weaker from this unexpected fasting. The bitter, pungent brew he had drunk in the morning somehow strengthened him. Is it a long walk? Sergio asked his first question after half an hour. Are you tired already? Grandma Sarah, walking ahead, looked back at him. No, Sergio shrugged, I just haven't dared to ask you anything. Ask, why play in silence? It's more fun that way. I wanted to know how it happened that you and my grandfather became such good friends. It's a complicated story, Grandma Sarah said, a tangled one. Didn't your grandfather tell you anything about his past? No. He became quieter and seemed lost in his thoughts more and more over time. I see, it seems you also have a penchant for silence. You have someone to share it with, Grandma Sarah remarked. I wasn't particularly inquisitive in conversations with my grandfather. He loved me, I loved him, and that was enough for us. You know you're part Jewish, right? So, in our forests, the old woman began, cautiously feeling her way with the staff along a path known only to her. The men were partisans during the war. They didn't want to surrender with their Jewish community. It was better for them to die with weapons in their hands than to be captured because of their origin. My mother was still alive then, and I was just a girl, barely 16. Your grandfather, Isaac, was 4 years older than me. He lived not in our village but in the neighboring one, 10 miles away on the other side of the swamp. Now, there's no trace left of that village. When the soldiers came there, Isaac went into the woods to join the partisans. The messengers had stopped coming for some reason. Maybe the forest spirits led him astray, or maybe he just lost his way, wandering through the woods and swamps for 2 weeks until he was completely exhausted. It was the year 1943, and autumn had already begun. The German troops were retreating in full force at that time, but then some units got stuck, worn out, hungry, and angry. They wanted to get home too. Whether they had a special mission or their commanders abandoned them, who knows now? They were ruthless. They reached our area, searching for partisans, looking for Jews, and taking away the last bit of bread. They stormed into our house where my mother and I lived. They grabbed me. Lead us, they said. Juden, where's your partisan group hiding? And why they thought I would lead them is a mystery. I was just a young girl, how could I possibly know? I hardly knew the swamps then. My mother only took me to the outskirts, and to that particular place only once. But she looked at me and seemed to give her consent. Lead them, as if I knew where. So, I led them secretly through the marshes to that special place. They were suspicious all the way. Apparently, they knew about that very Russian Susannan well. They kept an eye on me the whole time. I kept hearing, Schneller, schneller, kaputt. I was trembling all over, but I did my job. By nightfall, we reached the right spot. We gathered some brushwood along the way and lit a fire, which smoked more than it burned. They were afraid the partisans would notice and attack at night. Well, in general, you'll soon understand that you shouldn't joke about smoke in that place. The Germans were weakened. The let 'em knows what to do. And I had become used to it by then. I took the stick and went back to my mother. I stumbled upon Isaac in the early morning. He was completely exhausted in the middle of the swamp, standing there like a tree. He didn't even remember how he ended up there. I led him back to our village, although the Germans had burned down the neighboring one along with all the poor Jews. So, he stayed with us. Temporarily. And what happened to the Germans in the swamps? Sergio inquired. Why worry about them? Although, of course, not all of them came there willingly. As planned, they all disappeared to hell. Without an experienced guide, there's no way back from there. My grandfather never told me about this. At first, our people didn't really accept him, Grandma Sarah continued. The partisans from the forests never returned to the village either. In the swamps, whether you were German or a local, you all looked the same. Maybe the villagers thought Isaac was somehow involved with them. But he wasn't, he barely survived himself. That's how we became friends. I suppose he felt guilty for not having fought the Fritz with them. He was quite skilled in his village. He even became the village chairman in '42, despite his reluctance. No one opposed the chairman because they understood that without him, no one would manage the remaining machinery. The men who returned from the war were suspicious of people like Isaac. They judged him by their frontline measure. It took many years for attitudes to soften. Isaac didn't seek friendship from anyone. He was proud. At one point, he moved to the city, found a woman for himself, and they even had a child together, your mother. But something went wrong between them, and they separated, so he returned. However, he never severed ties with his ex-wife or daughter. He had a good and just heart. Now, here we are at the spot. Look. They reached a small hill, the top of which was flat and perfectly level. It was surrounded by low bushes on 3 sides, all adorned with clusters of white blossoms. A pungent, slightly sweet aroma, reminiscent of fermented wine, wafted from them. Is this the ledum? Sergio asked. That's it, the old woman nodded. Spread the straw around it. Together, they spread the entire pile of straw on the ground in a semicircle, and Grandma Sarah set it on fire. Thick plumes of smoke began to cover the horizon. The scent of the smoldering ledum became even sharper and denser, and Sergio's head began to feel slightly hazy. Now, keep your eyes peeled, Grandma Sarah said. Look beyond the smoke. What am I looking for? As soon as you notice 2 red dots, keep your eyes on them. Don't be afraid, just look at them. They will start getting closer, and you stay right where you are. What dots are you talking about? The swamp snake will come because of the scent. A snake? Exclaimed Sergio. What snake? You'll see for yourself, she said, grabbing his shoulders from behind. I'll be right here, don't be afraid. Watch carefully. The main thing is not to take your eyes off them. All right, Sergio agreed. But his voice sounded as if it were coming from the side, as if someone else were speaking, not him. The wall of smoke that had already blocked the sun began to quiver and spiral, and in those rapidly twisting spirals, 2 bright red dots flickered. They were approaching rapidly, changing their position from left to right and from top to bottom. Sergio stared at them without blinking, and when the lights were right in front of him, he saw the snake itself. It was its eyes. The creature itself appeared before him in all its colossal glory, greenish-brown, with glowing scales along its flat, horned head. The snake hovered above him and then, in an elusive moment, coiled around Sergio's body in rings. It twisted around him, sometimes shrinking, then expanding in size, and it squeezed harder and harder, as if in a vice. The heat became unbearable. Sergio couldn't take a breath anymore, realizing in horror that it was the end. He tried to turn his head to see Grandma Sarah standing behind him, but that had become impossible too. He wanted to scream from the excruciating pain that pierced him. And then he woke up. He was lying on the same stove in Grandma Sarah's house, his head covered with herbs and sunflower petals. What had just happened? Was it a dream? They had indeed gone to the swamp, and the snake was real. The wall of smoke that had hidden the horizon, all of it. Sergio crawled out from under the herbs and hopped off the stove. There was Wolf and his clothes on the bench. Soon, Grandma Sarah would come out of the neighboring room and say, "Well, have some tea, and we'll get ready to go." He got dressed and hesitated, looking at the curtain that separated the two adjacent rooms, then at Pitch Black, the raven, perched on its little stick. But the curtain remained motionless, and Pitch Black made no sound. Well, perhaps that's for the best. Sergio breathed a sigh of relief, walked into the hallway, rinsed his face with cold water from the sink, and descended from the porch into the yard with the dog. Outside, Grandma Sarah was scattering feed from a wooden bucket, and around her, 5 chickens busily pecked at the grains. "Good morning," Sergio said. "Good morning," the old woman greeted him quietly. Sergio looked at her attentively and was slightly taken aback. She had changed. Her face had become more gaunt and somewhat darker. Her eyes seemed to have faded, and her gaze was turned inward. Her once confident movements had become constrained and uneven. But Sergio didn't dare voice his observations or ask anything. Grandma Sarah smiled faintly and approached him. "Our adventures with you will end here," she said. "Now you need to go. The guest at your grandfather's house is already waiting for you." "What guest?" "The herald," Grandma Sarah said again in her mysterious manner. "Hurry, or he might leave. But wait for one more thing." "Hold on, I'll be right back." The old woman went into the house and returned a minute later with a small paper bag. "Here," she handed it to Sergio. "These are herbs. When you return to the city, brew them and drink it with your wife until it's finished." "Am I going back to the city?" Sergio was surprised. "That's for you to decide," Grandma Sarah said calmly. "Talk to the guest, and then make your decision. Just wait for 3 more days if you plan to leave. Take care of the house, get everything in order there, and don't forget to eat. How are you feeling?" It should have been Sergio asking Grandma Sarah that question, given her exhausted appearance. Sergio lowered his gaze in embarrassment and replied, "I'm feeling fine." He listened to his inner self and indeed found no weakness, no remnants of pain, no nausea. "What about my illness?" he asked as if to himself. Grandma Sarah set the wooden bucket aside, took off her headscarf, and sat down on the porch step. "Whatever I tell you now," she replied, "you won't believe. After all, you initially mistook me for a ghost," she smiled wearily. "When you go for your checkup, you'll see for yourself. And here's the thing. For these 3 days, please don't bother me. You'll come to say goodbye when Pitch Black brings you the message." "The raven?" "He's my messenger now. Wait for him, then make your final decision. Everything now depends on you." "All right, Grandma Sarah, thank you for everything. I'll do as you say." "Do it, son, don't forget. And now, go with God. Take care of the dog, he's a good one, understanding." Deep in thought, they, along with Wolf, made their way back home. Wolf, too, seemed lost in his own doggy thoughts. He hardly looked into Sergio's face, as he usually did, and occasionally shook his head, as if lamenting some errors known only to him. Near the remaining bench by the house, they were indeed greeted by a guest. It was Matilda. "What a surprise!" Sergio exclaimed. "What brings you here?" Matilda spread her hands. "I'm looking for you. I didn't expect this. How did you find this house?" "There's only one inhabited house here. Marina told me. She even drew a map of how to get to the village. True, I got a bit lost in the forest, but I made it. I wrote not to look for me and not to worry." "Did something happen?" "Sergio," Matilda lowered her head, "Marina is completely distraught. She's been tormented. And I blurted out something I shouldn't have to, now I feel guilty." "What's bothering her?" Sergio couldn't help but ask. "I gave her freedom. Let the doctor take care of her. And you've brought trouble upon yourself for no reason." "But there's no doctor anymore, Sergio." Matilda was almost in tears. "Marina had a breakdown due to nervous tension. She didn't even realize what she was doing. And now she's completely lost. Don't think I'm justifying her. It's not my place to judge. I'm just worried about her, Sergio. I'm afraid of what she might do to herself. Please come back and talk to her, somehow calm her down, explain to her the reason behind your escape. Running away like this isn't right. Sergio silently sat down on the bench next to Matilda and embraced her shoulder. What else was there to clarify? Everything had become clear. Do you want me to drive you to the highway? Sergio finally asked after a few minutes. Did you come here by bus, or did someone give you a ride? Who would give me a ride? I came by bus. So, what should I tell Marina? Should she wait for you to return, or what? I'll be back in 3 days. 3 days? Are you sure? Absolutely. Why not today? There's one thing left. I need to wait for someone, and then I can go. You've become different, Sergio. You just haven't seen me in a long time. No, your voice is different, and your words are different. Sorry for the silly question, but are you okay? I couldn't be better, Sergio said, and thought that this is how it is now. He hadn't felt this good and peaceful in the past year. He smiled. It all feels surreal, Matilda said cautiously. It's like I'm dreaming all of this. And this village is so strange. I haven't met anyone except you. And you seem unusual too. But it's peaceful here, as if there's no other world. I feel at home here, Sergio said quietly. But it's also a bit eerie, the girl shrugged. I can't imagine being here alone for a whole week. I'd go crazy. Wolves howl at night here, you know. I'm not alone, I have Wolf. And they've never seen any wolves here. Although who knows now? The dog barked. Matilda laughed, wiping away the last tears from her face. Exactly, she said, and that's even stranger. Sergio also burst into laughter. Their unrestrained, slightly desperate laughter continued for a long time, mixing with the joyful barking of Wolf and the whistling of swallows swiftly flying low over the ground. 3 days later, as Grandma Sarah had promised, Pitch Black arrived. He arrived early, at 3:30 in the morning, so Sergio initially thought it was Matilda returning or perhaps Marina herself had come. He wasn't prepared to meet his wife yet. Sergio hastily got dressed and went outside. Overnight, the sky had become overcast with low clouds, making the surroundings gloomy and devoid of color. Sergio's heart felt heavy. Christopher! The raven croaked. Christopher! And he darted back towards the forest. Wolf looked at Sergio expectantly. The closer they got to Grandma Sarah's house, the clearer her words, which Sergio hadn't understood before, became to him. Her words about the last promise she made to his late grandfather and the warning not to go to the cemetery for now, along with her own visibly ailing appearance 3 days ago. 3 days. Even in this number, the true meaning of her words shone through. So, what Sergio saw when he entered the hut didn't frighten him. Grandma Sarah lay in her bed, her face expressing serene joy. She even seemed to have rejuvenated, appearing as Sergio remembered her from his childhood. Her eyes were closed, her hands were peacefully folded on her chest. Wolf circled in place again and silently ran out of the house through the open door. The lamp, which had always burned in front of the icon of St. Christopher, had extinguished. A tiny wisp of black smoke from its last flicker hung in the air, curling into intricate patterns. It thundered outside, and rare, heavy raindrops rustled through the leaves and needles. The window swung open from the gust of wind, and the smell of wet earth, as it can only be in the first minutes after rainfall, rushed into the room. Sergio closed the window and locked it with a latch. When the sky had finished crying, and the high blue sky started to shimmer with golden sunlight, Sergio ran to his house to get the car. He placed a shovel he had found in the pantry into the trunk and returned, squeezing through the broken trees along the path to the swamp. He gently placed the almost weightless Grandma Sarah on the rear seat of the car and, along with the silent Wolf, headed to the cemetery. He quickly found his grandfather's grave. Nothing much had changed in the cemetery over the past 2 years, except for the overgrown weeds, claiming their territory. In an hour, Sergio had dug a hole of the right size right next to his grandfather's grave. Throughout this time, Pitch Black had watched him from the wooden cross. When the work was finished, and the last handful of soil had been thrown onto the newly formed mound, a crow cawed and flew into the forest, in the opposite direction from Babu Duzia's hut. Now it was free and could fly wherever it pleased. Tears welled up in Sergio's eyes, but they weren't tears of sorrow or pain. Instead, they seemed like quiet joy that everything had worked out just as it should. This is what Grandma Sarah had wanted, and she knew it long before the guest arrived in the village. Life gives, and life doesn't take away. It continues to flow, offering people endless choices. Now Sergio had to make a decision. His journey was not yet complete. However, he already knew for sure what he needed to do to maintain the emerging harmony that was trying to include him in this unhurried flow of life. He deported 5 bewildered chickens from the chicken coop to the car. He couldn't leave them here at the mercy of fate. They, too, were one of the notes in this symphony of spheres. Sergio had no idea what to do with them in the city, but he would come up with something. It was a small matter for him now. And Marina, she would be surprised by these newcomers in their garage. Wolf reacted calmly to the birds, apparently having made friends with them during that time. The journey back to the city this time didn't seem as long. Under the clucking of the chickens and the happy barking of the dog, the group safely returned to where it all began. The city eagerly awaited its fugitives. Sergio's heart raced as he climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor and approached the door of his apartment. How long had he been in the village? A week? 10 days? More? All the tenses and dates were jumbled up in his head. What meaning did they have now? Perhaps he needed his grandfather's calendar to mark important dates. Life was starting anew. At this very moment, when he turned the key in the lock. Click, and new opportunities lay ahead. As Sergio stepped across the threshold, the familiar sense washed over him. Wolf, with joyful barking, darted from the hallway to the kitchen and back, returning with Marina. His wife looked disheveled, with a messy tangle of thick red hair, but it only made her more beautiful. She rushed into Sergio's embrace and burst into tears. "Forgive me, Sergio, forgive such an idiot," she blurted out. "You'll forgive me, won't you?" "Of course, Marina," Sergio replied, patting her head. "And you forgive me for running away without explaining anything to you. But it's all in the past now. Everything will be different. You'll see." A few days later, Sergio's doctor was baffled as he examined a patient who, just 4 months ago, had no chance at all. How is this possible, he wondered to himself. Obviously, there must have been some mix-up with the scans and tests. Yes, that must be it.
If you're enjoying it as well, leave a like and subscribe.